Hello everybody and welcome to the Artistry House, the home of the British Institute of Professional Photography. Today we're going to do one of the three favourite things, and on the line today we've got Mr. John Miskelly. Good afternoon, John. How are you?
Hi Martin, I'm great, thanks. Yourself?
I'm very well, thanks. And for the people who don't know, John is a fellow with the British Institute of Professional Photography. He's an amazing landscape photographer, as well as a chartered accountant who's actually done quite a lot of work. And I'm sure some of you watched the interview we did with him at the start of lockdown, where he very, very clearly told us what was happening and what we could do, which was fantastic. A lot of people probably don't know, but John is also the treasurer for the RPS, Royal Photographic Society. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that, if I can, and just as an organisation, they're a little bit different than ourselves. Maybe you could, first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself for the people who don't know you, and then we'll have a chat about the RPS, if that's okay.
Okay, thanks very much. I started off my life in the BBC, which is where the photography came from before becoming, as you say, a chartered accountant for all sorts of reasons, which really should only be discussed over a beer. But I've run a photographic business as well as a consultancy business now for a number of years, and enjoy the balance of the logical and the creative as well. And you mentioned the RPS. I've been a member of the RPS probably as long as the BIPP, which is about 20 odd years, I'm guessing. And it's just an organisation like the BIPP that's a membership organisation that's there for its members and does some great work. And I was asked would I be prepared to be treasurer about a year ago, and was elected at the AGM last September. And some people may be aware that Simon Hill, who's another fellow of the BIPP, became president-elect just last week. So we've got good BIPP representation in the RPS as we plan our takeover bid, can I say?
It's very funny. The RPS are an amazing organisation. For those who don't know, they recently had their own building. I think did they build it or they bought it? Certainly in Bath now, isn't it?
They bought the building shell, and then they fitted it out with a gallery, sort of theatre-style seating for 100 people in the training room. They've got some library space as well, and they've got office space in the building. So it's a great facility and a great building. And we've talked on and off about the idea of forging closer links between the two organisations as we go forward, because both organisations have a very strong and long history.
Yes.
Both represent their members, I believe, very, very well. So I think there's a lot of areas where we can share ideas and possibly resources as well. So I think it'd be quite nice to see that happen.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that. And a lot of people don't realise that the RPS were actually the very first photographic organisation in the world. And the British Institute, 1901, was the first professional organisation.
Yeah.
So they've kind of run alongside each other for such a long time, and it'll be really, really. I'm quite excited about us forging closer links together, and we'll see what we can do, as you say, with the president-elect and yourself as the treasurer. We've got some friends in high places, let's say. So landscape
or low places, as they may say.
So landscape photography. What attracted you and what got you into doing landscape photography? It seems a polar opposite to a chartered accountant, and so.
Yeah, it's quite different. I first, like a lot of photographers, landscapes interest me, but I first went to a talk by Joe Cornish, which many people will be aware of. Joe, probably the most famous landscape photographer around the UK, around about 2001, 2002. A chap called Jim Merland, who some of the older members will remember.
Jim, yeah.
Jim used to bring really big names across to Northern Ireland, and he brought Joe across, and Joe did a talk, which a number of us went to. I was just inspired to get interested in landscape photography. I bought a set of leaf filters, I bought all the kit, and it sat in my studio for the next 5 years before I did anything with it. And it wasn't until 2007 that I went to Venice with a couple of friends, and we started taking landscapes. And I started to get into the way of getting up early in the morning, which was a bit of a shock to the system as a former, social photographer doing the usual sort of portraits and weddings. And then over the years, I've evolved into a full-time landscape photographer, really from 2011. I started just doing landscapes and didn't do weddings, portraits, commercial photography. I dropped all of that quite quickly thereafter, and I've been doing landscapes ever since.
So who would you, I know it's very difficult to do, but who is a landscape purchaser of images then? Who do you find are your customers that commercially would purchase landscape images or commission you to do this kind of work?
Most of my work would be for some of the tourist boards in Ireland specifically. There's Tourism Ireland and Board Fulshire in the south of Ireland, and I've done a lot of work for them. About 3 years ago, I think it was now, I did a massive project on what's called the Wild Atlantic Way, which I think is one of the longest coastal routes in Europe, something like about 2,500 kilometers long. And they had me spend the best part of the year, not constantly, but on and off, traveling to some of their iconic places along the Wild Atlantic Way and shooting what they called hero images. And I've done stuff for them in Belfast, I've done stuff for them in other parts of the coast, etc., etc. And I'll work for a lot of those clients. I'll also do workshops for just whoever's interested in learning about landscape photography, quite often around coast of Ireland or coast of Scotland. Do quite a lot of camera club workshops, and I also sell some fine art prints, so that's not a massive part of the business. It sort of comes and goes a little bit. Sometimes it gets quite busy and other times fairly quiet. But between those three strands, that would be the main part of my business these days.
And it's amazing. I think that a lot of photographers would say you've got the dream job, because I do know a lot of social photographers, commercial photographers, what they like to do themselves is go and do landscape stuff, and some of them are very, very good at it, but it's very rare to actually meet somebody who can do landscapes and from a commercial point of view make a living from it as well. But what advice would you give to people, maybe just getting into landscape, or that maybe it's been more of a hobby but they feel like they want to try and kind of from a commercial point of view make some money out of it? Have you got any advice that you could give to them?
I would say don't rely on it making you a living from day one. Probably like any part of photography these days. Years ago, people would have said you'll do better at weddings or portraits or whatever. And the irony is now I actually get more work sometimes than colleagues I know that are in the wedding and portrait business, because everybody picks up a digital camera is suddenly a wedding photographer, as we all know. It's about client relationships. Like a lot of photography, it's about client relationships. I've built up good relationships with my client base over the years, and they will give me commissions on a regular basis, and that's the bread and butter of it. Again, you get lots of people setting themselves up as landscape photography workshop tutors, and I see them come and go after maybe a couple of years. It doesn't really work out for them. It's the old thing, you've got to build up a reputation, you've got to build up a body of work, you've got to get known for people to book you to do workshops on an ongoing basis. And any landscape photographer I know that runs workshops, I know a number of them, they probably all have an existing client base who will book quite often again and again and again. And I've groups that book me every year to do a long weekend for them, and the same people come every year with maybe one or two changes. And so it's about client relationships, like all aspects of photography. It's delivering what they require on time to a fair price and the quality of work they expect.
Okay, that's good. And you mentioned leaf filters there as well. And I guess for people who are interested in landscape photography but never given it a go, I mean, I actually love landscape photography as well. I think it's just, there's something about it, and never would dream about it doing commercially, but I just absolutely love it. But obviously filters are one of the biggest parts of that. But what other equipment does somebody need to go out and start taking landscape imagery then?
I mean, the main thing I think you need, well, it depends what you're doing, but I use a tripod because I specialize in long exposure work or else panorama work. So between my tripod and my filters, that's really the only thing you need. A lot of it comes down to spending the time. I do a lot of research beforehand to try to find the right locations, to work out what the best time of the year is to give me the right light, following weather forecast, tides, and so on and so forth. And a lot of it is about planning. And yes, you're still at the mercy of the weather. Things can go wrong. It can all go pear-shaped very, very quickly. But you increase your chances if you do a lot of planning. So a lot of winter nights I'll be planning for shoots. But most of my work is actually in winter time. I don't like getting up at like 2:30 in the morning in the summer. You talk about the dream job, except when the alarm goes off at 2:30 to drive somewhere for a 4:30 a.m. sunrise. And I remember doing a workshop for a camera club probably 5 years ago, and they insisted on doing it in June. And I remember getting to bed after sunset and getting back to my hotel at 11:30 at night and I was up again at 3 in the morning to go back out with the group again. And I think at the end of the weekend, not only were they shattered, I was shattered as well.
Yeah.
So a lot of my stuff I do, and really my season for workshops and a lot of my commission work would be from late September, early October through until probably about April. And I do a lot less in the summertime just because of the long, long days. I do some, but I do a lot less. More sunset in the summer.
I remember having a conversation with you once. We were talking about exposure times, and I can't remember what it was in relation to, but I mean, you're up at the 12-minute mark, aren't you, for some of your kind of exposures? For
Yeah, that would be sort of top end. Most of my exposures are 4 to 8 minutes long.
Yeah.
And some of the images we'll talk about, you'll see long exposures are a key part of it. But I started off doing panoramas originally.
Yeah.
My specialism. And a lot of my clients come to me for panorama images that can be blown up to be maybe 4 or 5 meters wide for exhibitions and shows around the world.
And is that with stitching work together, or? Yeah.
That's stitching. Yeah, I use a specialized panorama head on my tripod, made by Really Right Stuff, and then I stitch on the computer after that as well.
Yeah, amazing, brilliant. I'm looking forward to seeing some of these images then, John. So if you don't mind sharing your screen and talking us through what your 3 images. So again, for the people who've never seen one of these interviews before, it's not about what's been the most commercially successful. It's just what the photographer, and in this case John, his favourite images that he's ever taken. So wow, it's just straight away. It's just a wow, isn't it?
Yeah, this was taken actually. This was relatively early in my landscape career. This is a place I'm sure a lot of folks will recognise, Elgol on the Isle of Skye in Scotland, and it had been raining all weekend, literally raining all weekend as it does in Scotland. This was in, I think, February time. You can see the snow in the distant hills. And I found this spot, the weather changed about an hour before sunset. I think sunset was about 5:30, 6 o'clock in the evening, being wintertime. And I got my position here. And this is one of the stitch panoramas I mentioned, Martin.
Yeah.
I think this is about 4 or 5 images stitched together. Wow. Each exposure being 30 seconds. Now, some people think it's difficult to do stitched images that are long exposure, but at 30 seconds, the sky is not moving so dramatically that it's going to cause a problem. And there's always maybe a little bit of just smoothing out in post-production afterwards.
Yeah.
But this was the light. This wasn't photoshopped or anything like that. The light had been quite bland about 20 minutes beforehand, but then it got lovely golden light just before sunset whenever I captured this image. And the interesting thing was that just directly in front of me on the rocks, after I'd captured this, I was waiting to see if the light improved, and 3 photographers walked in front of me and set up their tripods and just decided that it didn't matter that they were in front. And that's the difficulty with somewhere like Elgol that's so popular.
Yeah.
Been there numerous times since, and it's such a busy place. I tend not to go nowadays.
Did you ever go with John, or did you just throw them straight into the sea?
I did say something to them along the lines of, "Excuse me, guys, but you realise you're directly in front of me," and their answer couldn't be printed on the BIPP site, I'm afraid, Martin. Of course, I didn't say anything back to them at all.
No, that's a beautiful image. So 5 images stitched together, roughly about 30-second exposure.
Yeah.
And I guess the mist is actually water, isn't it, running in and out on the left-hand side?
Yeah, that's the waves lapping over the rocks, giving that sort of misty effect that's become so well known over the years. At this stage, this is probably about, I'm guessing it's about 2010-ish. So it's about 10 years ago. And long exposure was popular back then, but it's become increasingly popular in the intervening years, especially, as you say, with the filters. And I'm an ambassador for Lee.
Yeah.
So clearly, I think Lee filters are fabulous. But without filters to control the difference between sky and land, there would be a graduated filter in the sky here, and there would have been a big stopper to give me the long exposure. So without my filters, I couldn't do this sort of work.
That's exactly what I was going to ask next, because from the limited experience I've got, that you're right, you've got to have filters, because the sky can be 4 or 5 stops different to the foreground, and the control that you've got here is amazing. The detail in the stone, and you've got detail all the way through the shadows, but the highlights are so well controlled. And I was going to say, ask you what kind of, if you could even remember from kind of 10 years ago. So there's a graduated filter on for the sky, and then and a big soft one as well.
There'll be a soft grad on the sky, probably a 3-stop. I think it was soft grad in the sky, just as you say, to control that. The sky, especially as we get at sunset and sunrise, the difference between sky and land becomes even more sort of significant than it does quite often during the day. And without that, as you say, the highlights wouldn't be able to be controlled, or else the shadows would be totally black. So I would have used a 3-stop grad in the sky. And as I say, in those days, there only really was a big stopper at that stage, the 10-stop, which gave me the 30-second exposure. Since then, there's a little stopper and the super stopper and everything else. But at that stage, it would have been simply the big stopper, would have been what I was using.
I know Lee, they do that app as well, don't they? Because it's not as simple as you think to calculate 10 stops, because it's not kind of as simple as that, is it? It's
so you have to work it out. There's a little laminated card that they supply, which is great, or you can use the app. The problem with an app is you have it on your phone and the battery can run out at an inopportune time sometimes in the landscape. But it's also got to the stage, I know if it's without a filter on, if it's a 30th of a second exposure, that becomes 30 seconds with a 10-stop. So I just move, either side of that, knowing that sort of rough rule of thumb, and that enables me to calculate it in my head fairly easily. You just get used to that for a little while.
I'll tell you what's has amazed me as well. I've got a Fuji X-T3, and the live view on the back of that actually compensates when you put a filter on as well. You can actually see in the live view what you do, which is you can't. It's mind bending how that can work.
It's great, because I had an XT2 and an XT3 for a period of time, and it was a revelation to be able to see, especially for somebody like me that would do panoramas, who used to have to remove the filter to recompose.
Yes.
But with the square filters, it was quite easy. You just slide it up, recompose, and then slide it back down. In the very early days, I used to use a B&W circular filter, which I used to have to screw on, screw off, screw on, screw off. And now with the square filters in the Lee holder, it just makes life so much easier. But as you say, with the XT3, you can actually see the image with a 10-stop filter on it.
Yeah, so it's just mind-blowing how that works.
Yeah, fabulous.
Yeah, beautiful image that, John. Really, really stunning.
Yep.
So the next one?
Next one, quite a different location, Venice, absolutely. Wow. Taken from Santa Maria, the church. This was getting up one morning. This was November, I think about 2 or 3 years ago. And I'd got up in the morning as planned, got the water bus across to Santa Maria from San Marco. Mm-hmm. And I had this shot in mind. I'd been there the day before, just working out the exact exposure. And this was an 8-minute exposure, single shot. It's not a panorama this time. And I took the shot. If I was doing a talk, I would show the shots I've taken before when the sky was still very dark, and it got light reasonably quickly. And as it went through the getting lighter, the lights on the far side went off, and the shot died. It just didn't work any longer without the lights on. Yeah. So there was a moment when I got one 8-minute exposure that worked, and then the next 8-minute exposure was relatively flat in comparison. Yeah. Again, I would have been using filters. I would have probably used, I can't remember, it was a 0.2 or 0.3 soft graduated filter for the sky, just to hold it back. And then it would have been, for an 8-minute exposure, this was probably a super stopper to give me that length of exposure, which is a 15-stop filter, which means you can see nothing through the camera. You just have to hope that it works. And it did. And the interesting thing about this shot, whenever I took this, I was taking one more, as I say, whenever the lights had gone out, not knowing if it would work or not. And this cruise liner decided it was going to go right directly in front of the shot, and totally spoiled it, so I had to take another one. And that's the problem with Venice. There's an awful lot of water buses, water taxis, cruise liners going along. And if a water bus goes across this on 8 minutes, it probably won't show. But where it becomes a problem is if it's got lights on it.
Yes. Because
the lights leave a light trail,
yes,
which is very difficult to take off in post-production. So again, you have to get to that stage of the morning when hopefully they're actually switching their lights off and it doesn't show. I remember one time an ambulance, speedboat ambulance going past me on a shot, and the blue flashing lights gave me a blue flash right across the image because they were so bright. Yeah. So again, you've sort of got to time these things, and you hope that not too much goes past in your 8 minutes, but you cannot stop boats obviously going across your shot. I don't think I would be appreciated. So Venice is somewhere I go to quite often, Martin. It's a fabulous city. I don't do a lot of cityscapes, but this is one of the places I do, which combines landscapes and cities as well.
Well,
And,
as you know, my past life with Graph Studio, we used to fly into Marco Polo Airport and then go
yeah,
up to the factory. And every time I would, which was 5-6 times a year, on the way back, I would always spend a day or two in Venice because there is no place like it on the planet. It is so
yeah,
unique. And you're right. And when you put this picture up, I recognised it straight away. Obviously, as Venice. But my
yeah,
question, in which you've already answered, is because I've tried to get some really decent kind of cityscapes as well. Is how did you manage not to get anything, any gondolas or any of the water taxis?
yeah,
You're right, those cruise ships they kind of come in about daybreak, don't they? And there's
yeah,
4 or 5 of them sometimes, and they're
yeah,
150, 200 meters long. 150,000 tons of cruise ship, and they're just,
yeah.
they're talking about banning them or moving them further down the coast because they're
That's right.
actually damaging
You
the.
are, you are talking about that, and hopefully they do, because I'm not sure a big cruise ship suits going into Venice. I don't mind it being in Venice, but I don't think going along the Grand Canal is the most sensible thing for the architecture there. But no, it's the 8-minute exposure is the key, where you then get total smooth water with nothing going across it. And all I've done on that in post-production is slightly lighten the water at the bottom and maybe a little bit of tweaking of the image, but there's not an awful lot of post-production on that. What I get in camera tends to be as good or as close to the final image as possible. Yes, I do post-production, but I don't have to do vast amounts to get these things to work. And
No,
as I say,
no convergent verticals either. It's almost like a tilt shift lens around it, something to get the, it's very, very vertical.
yeah. Well, I'm directly opposite the buildings, so
Yeah.
There's not been an issue. But I do use tilt shift lenses if I need to.
Yeah.
Because for years my tilt shift 24mm lens I used to use a Nikon, the various D800 series up to the 850, and I recently moved to the Z7. And the reason I moved to the Z7 was I could still keep my tilt shift lenses with the adapter and still use those, because I do shoot certain buildings that I don't like converging verticals personally. It doesn't suit my style. There's nothing wrong, with people doing that, but it's not what I try to do. I try to get them correctly vertical, if you like.
Yeah, Sean Conboy, you'll be very proud of you with that, I tell you.
Absolutely. Sean's taught me everything I know about architecture.
Okay, beautiful images again, John. And your third and final image that you love.
Third and final image, quite different. This was taken last year, 2019, end of February, start of March, in Lofoten Islands, off the coast of Norway. I'd been to Lofoten 5 years beforehand, and there hadn't been a vast amount of snow 5 years beforehand, so I decided with a friend of mine we'd go back last year. And I'd been speaking to some locals that I know, and they said if you go at the end of February, start of March, you tend to get the best snow. And we actually got less snow because it rained the whole week we were there. The weather was quite miserable. And anybody that's been up there knows when it's wet in the Lofoten Islands, you're well above the Arctic Circle. It can be cold, it can be miserable. And this was one of those cases. Now, this particular beach, which is well known in the Lofoten Islands, I'd been there a couple of days beforehand, and I got the headland in, and I got these rocks in, and I got a nice long exposure. And as you can see in the headland, there's not as much snow as you might normally expect. And it was a nice shot and everything else. But we went back, myself and my friend, one morning at first light, probably about 7:30 or something like that in the morning, 7:30. And we're on these rocks, and I could see this storm coming in, and it was moving in, and there were a couple of other photographers around as well, as tends to happen. And they all very quickly packed up their gear because it was looking fairly unpleasant. And I was the only person standing on these rocks in the wind with this storm and the rain coming in. And I stood there because the rain was coming in from my side, and it was coming in at such an angle it wasn't actually hitting the front of the lens and hitting the filters. And I was able to stay on these rocks and get this shot. And I loved the mood of the headland just showing through the storm and no more. And almost a case of what's actually there. What are the clouds hiding with the rocks in the foreground and the soft light? I think this was either a 2 or a 4 minute exposure. I should recollect, and I can't. So it was quite a long exposure to get the smooth water. but just trying to make sure that my tripod didn't move in the wind was probably the biggest challenge.
Yeah.
As I said, it's a pretty windy place. I got the shot and I packed up and was never as glad to get back into the car. And we were staying in an Airbnb, probably about 15 minutes away, so we weren't terribly far. And a warm cup of coffee was never more welcome than after this particular morning. But I just liked the mood of it, and it was just a little bit different to the usual shot you see from this location.
There's two questions there. One is, that is one of the most annoying things when I've tried landscape is if you get a bit of rain or a bit of drizzle, you get it on that filter and it's such a pain. Yeah. And you don't actually sometimes know until you're looking at the image on a computer and you can see that there's so I don't know how you overcome that. And secondly, are there filters on this, or was this kind of
there was just I think it was only a 2-stop graduated filter, just again to keep the sky down a bit. I didn't really need it, to be fair, but it was on. And this was a big stopper because I think it was a 4-minute exposure, but it wasn't that bright.
Yeah.
So a big stopper this time again, for my long exposures, there's almost no shots that I take that don't have either a little stopper, a big stopper, or a super stopper.
Yeah.
And your point about the rain is absolutely right. I think I said at the start, the rain was coming in from the side slightly. Yeah. So I was able to position myself in a way that it didn't actually hit the filters. Yeah. But I will often carry on my camera bag a little very small portable umbrella.
Yeah.
Which I will use to shelter the filter. Now, if it's really windy, it's obviously a bit of a challenge, but if it's not too windy, then I can usually just keep the umbrella in such an angle to keep raindrops off the front of the lens, because I shoot, you look at my work, a lot of it is sort of quite muted colors. Yeah. And I often shoot in quite bad weather, grey skies, often drizzly days, and I quite like the soft light that we get in those sort of conditions. So I have to accept the fact that it's going to be wet. Yeah. And if I don't use an umbrella and I've maybe left it behind for some reason, I'll often use my coat to keep the rain up, just hold it over the filters, keep it off the filters. Means I get wet, and obviously with a full head of hair, it goes curly when it gets wet. But it's more important to keep the rain off the filters, because as you say, when you get back and you get big raindrops on it, there's not much you can do in post-production, because inevitably it's on a piece of detail that spoils the shot. Yeah. If it's just a little bit, you can maybe do something with it. Wouldn't be the first time in a long exposure that a few raindrops have got onto the filter. And I've wiped the filter during the shot, got it off, and because it's a long exposure, me wiping the filter for 5 seconds doesn't even show up.
Yeah. Now I've had it where it's dropped between the filters as well, and you just go,
oh yeah. That can happen on a really wet day, and then there's nothing you can do about that, Martin. You just accept. You take it all apart, try and clean, put it back together, by which time it's got back onto it again. And working in wet weather is one of the challenges of a landscape photographer.
And I've noticed that everything is so pin sharp, which as a professional photographer you would expect it to be. But do you have a choice of kind of glass that you use that you get? Because even with these images here, the rocks are so pin sharp. So you obviously, a good glass is going to be really important, I'm guessing.
Oh, absolutely. Good glass is always critical. I mean, I think this was probably taken with the 2470 lens for the Nikon Z series, which is I don't normally use zoom lenses at all, but I've compared that to various fixed lenses and find the optics on it are so good. And that's where mirrorless, and the same with the Fuji glass. I used Fuji for quite a while. Yeah. I found the Fuji glass to be superb, but I still use my 24mm tilt shift, I can really speak, is still one of my favorite lenses. And whenever I go somewhere like this where I've got a lot of depth of field, I'll use the tilt shift lens just to give me that extra sort of reach. In this case, I didn't need it quite so much because the headland was so hazy anyway. Yeah. Even if it was slightly out of focus, it wouldn't have mattered. Yeah. As long as I got the foreground rock sharp, which is really, really important.
And you kind of intimated there, but prime lenses every day over zoom lenses, in that you get much.
Generally speaking, but as I say, I'm now finding that the mirrorless zoom lenses are getting to be so good. The idea that we had maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years ago that prime was always better than zoom lenses, that's starting to be broken down. And I'm using my 2470 zoom on my Z series more and more. And I'm really enjoying using it because it just gives me a lot more flexibility than changing prime lenses, especially in a wet, windy day when it's raining. And the last thing you need is to get any sort of moisture inside the camera, which is a real challenge.
Yeah, brilliant. John, fantastic. Three absolutely beautiful images, and you can see why, obviously proud to have you as one of our fellows. One of the other things I asked you to do is an image that's inspired you, where either to pick up a camera or just to go out every time with a camera. And so I'm hoping you've... Oh, here we go.
Okay, sorry it's a little bit small. It was the best copy of this I could get. A lot of people maybe don't know who Michael Levin is. He's not maybe so well known, but he's a bit like a Michael Kenna in some of his style, but I would say a slightly more modern version of him. And this is actually the cover of Michael Levin's book, a book called Vibrato, which I think is one of the nicest photographic books that you can possibly buy. Anybody that knows me knows I'm a big fan of photo books, and I tend to buy photo books from friends who are photographers, photographers I admire, and I've got a reasonably good collection here in my house. And this was a book I bought, I can't remember exactly, probably about 9 or 10 years ago. And it's just full of probably about 40 or 50 stunning images. As I say, this is a cover. He only shoots in black and white. He shoots quite a lot in Japan, which I've not done. And his black and white long exposure images, you can see the influences from people like this. Yes. I'm influenced by Michael Kenna. I've been influenced by Joe Cornish. We're all influenced by other photographers. Yeah. It's not a case of copying them. I'm not in favor of people copying somebody else. Yeah. But we're all influenced by things we see. I'm influenced by Japanese gardens, which is sort of a little bit unusual. That the form, the structure, sort of the way they're designed, the simplicity of a Japanese garden. And that, I believe, comes out in some of my photography as well. And that's why I like very simple compositions. That last one was one of my busier ones, but a lot of my stuff would be quite simple. And as I say, Michael Levin was one of those guys whose work I just think is fabulous. And it's well worth having a look. He's also got quite it's 1 or 2 YouTube videos just on a little sort of shoot he did in Japan. Yeah. And it's only about 3 or 4 minutes long. It's well worth having a look for that and seeing the sort of work he does. I just think he's a fabulous photographer.
Well, I tell you, I'm going to be ordering this book on Amazon tonight. I really am. Just the cover is stunning, isn't it?
It's a great book, and they're not all seascapes, but probably 75-80% of the images are seascapes. Yeah. He does a few other images as well, and as I say, quite a few around sort of the coast of Japan. And he photographed Japan before many other people, came across Japan, and Japan's become an increasingly popular workshop destination. But as I say, Michael Levin, along with the likes of Michael Kenna, were probably some of the first guys to discover some of the coastal areas and some of the temples around Japan, which have now been widely photographed by lots of other photographers.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for sharing those images and sharing that. Yep. As I say, I'm going to be ordering that this evening. So yep. Just before we go, obviously, I guess we're coming out of lockdown really now. For people who've watched these in chronological order, I think we would be week 10 or 11, I guess. And I always ask people we speak to, and you've already given us advice in the past on, from the accountant point of view, what advice you would give, or what would you suggest some of our members moving forward as we start to come out of lockdown, just to kind of get them back into business, really.
Yeah, it's a difficult one for me, and I'm moving into my quiet spell. I lost the end of my landscape season, if you like, but normally the summer is my quieter time whenever I'd be catching up with your website, bit of marketing, preparing workshops and so on. My difficulty has been that I've not been able to go out and do recce's in areas for some new workshops. So once flights come back on for me, then I want to get to some places and check out locations. I can do that very well because I tend to travel alone. So I can easily be socially distanced. The biggest challenge is getting places to stay and finding somewhere you can go for a meal come the evening time. Yeah. But a lot of my work, I wouldn't be the first time, far from it, that I actually take a tent and a little camping stove. I'm totally self-sufficient. I did quite a bit in France about 4 years ago, around the Gironde estuary, the fishing huts there, and did a lot of camping. The west coast of Ireland, which I did for the tourist boards, I did a lot of camping because I could be on the location. So I'm going to get out and about. I'm going to look for new places for some workshops. I have some new plans out there. Hopefully I can do something around July time. In the meantime, I've been exploring platinum printing of all things, which is an alternative process. I'm dabbling in that, and I'm doing a bit more of that at the moment. I'm just trying to make the best use of the time, if you like, Martin, because I can't do some of the things I might normally have done. So I'm trying to prepare some new lines of business for the future for some fine art prints.
And what's on your if you could go anywhere in the world to go and do some landscape photography tomorrow, anywhere in the world, and money was no object, and time was no object, and getting gear there's no object, where would that be?
I've been fortunate to travel a fair bit of the world, and I would probably still go back to Scotland and the Outer Hebrides. I just adore that part of the world. I think it's stunning. The Outer Hebrides, I probably shouldn't say it here, is still relatively quiet. I found Skye has become incredibly busy now because of I think it's the Highland 500 they call the road.
Yeah, the 500, yeah.
Promoted by the tourist board. So when I've last been in Skye, I found photo locations have been incredibly busy. But because the Hebrides is another ferry or another flight to get to, it's still very, very quiet. There's only a small number of us that do workshops there. So that's my sort of place of quietness and peace. And if I want to go somewhere to get away from internet and all those sort of modern day things, the Hebrides, the Isle of Harris is where I love being on their beaches.
Brilliant. On that note, thank you very much, John. That was brilliant. Thanks for showing us your images, and I hope soon you can get back out up into Scotland.
No problem. Thank you, Martin.